Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the August 20th Policy Committee meeting. I'd like to begin with introductions and administrative remarks. Introductions-wise, I'd just like to say welcome to the 2019-20 school year. It's great to have our student representative, Rachel, back, and our teacher representative, Mrs. McManaman, back. Welcome back. So glad you're both here. Glad that I'm getting around to my school board colleagues. I only have one this evening, Lydia. Welcome. Thanks for keeping me company here tonight. And welcome to Dr. Stevenson, our administrative liaison, and our solicitor, Mr. Diazio. And without any further ado, I'd like to move into administrative remarks. Do you have anything for us, Dr. Stevenson?
Yes, thank you, Chairwoman Goldman. We would like to say that as we look at today's policy outline agenda, we have several policies that for second read, then there's repeals, and then introduce a couple of policy discussions. But before that, I want to give an update about a couple of things that we did on the summer and some of the things that is going to be forthcoming. First of all, that you'll see in the Memorandum of Understanding, Memorandum of Understanding does not have to be approved, but what that is an ongoing agreement between the Radnor Township Police and the Radnor Township School District. This is what we update the language every 2 years, and so this is for information, and it is included in board docs. I want to thank my Director of Operations, Mark Brooks, for all the work he did for coordinating that. Over the summer, with the support of our solicitor, administrative team came together to review our current discipline policies. And when we looked at those policies, under the guidance of Superintendent Batchelor, we created an administrative team at each level, elementary, middle school, and high school. And the purpose of that is to review those discipline policies, come up with recommendations for the superintendent, and then we will bring at a later date for this committee to review and approve. In addition, this summer, again, our solicitor was very helpful. One of the things that we wanted to do was to coordinate the language in our handbooks, and we were able to have some of those language, particularly those that are pertaining to policies, were aligned with common language. So as the new handbooks will be distributed to parents and students this year, you'll find those particular differences, which is a good thing. Finally, there is one of the before we left with the part of the late start to school discussion, there was conversations about having some type of subcommittee about homework. That was tabled. However, Mr. Dan Bechtel, who is the new Director of Secondary Ed, who was instrumental from the administrative piece in working on the homework, the late start to school piece, will be coordinating with me to resurrect those conversations, and we hope next month to have an outline on what that will look like. Those would conclude my administrative remarks.
Thank you very much for those administrative remarks. So I hear that you're saying next month there will be an outline for the
There'll
homework.
be an update.
An update. Okay, that's good. Updates are good. Outlines are even better, but that's all good. Thank you very much. Does anybody have any questions or comments on the administrative remarks? Okay, so let's move into public comment, given that it looks like we only have one member of the public out there. Hello, would you like to make public comment, or? Okay, terrific. So unfortunately, no public comment tonight. We'll move into the approval of minutes. Does anybody have any comments, concerns, or questions about the minutes? Can we move them along for approval? All right, rolling right along, they are approved. So we will move into agenda item 4.1, Policy 200. I did want to just, perhaps I missed it, Dr. Stevenson, but the Memorandum of Understanding goes with policy 225, relations with law enforcement. So I'm not sure if that was mentioned, but I just wanted to make
Yes.
sure, okay, everybody made that connection, that it's not just out there, it goes with the particular policy, which is 225, relations with law enforcement, because that was, I'm not sure that was included on our materials today. All right, so going into the first agenda item, which is policy 200, enrollment in district, and as Dr. Stevenson said, this is a policy that's up for second read and adoption. We already went through the first read in June and didn't make any changes to it, right, Dr. Stevenson?
That is correct, and we're just asking that the committee recommends this move forward for its second read.
Okay. Does anybody have anything that's come up since the June business meeting and now that they would like to mention about this policy, or can we move it along for a second read next week? That's a head nod, yes. We're going to move this policy along, check that box. And that will move us into the second item on our agenda, 4.2, Policy 216, student records.
This policy also is coming back to the committee with no changes. Therefore, we are asking that the committee move this forward as well for the second read.
All right, so we covered this one at the June business meeting, no changes since then, ready for a second read, everybody? Okay, so this will be on our agenda next week at the business meeting. Moving right along, we have two policies that are going to be up for being repealed. We'll start with policy 917, parental family involvement.
I will let solicitor give a summarization on both of the rationale for those repeals.
Thank you. Just give me 1 second here. So we'll start with item 4.3 on the agenda, policy 917, parental family involvement. That policy is being recommended for repeal. As the committee may be familiar with, a couple months back, we revised policy 918, which was Title I parental engagement. And as a result of that policy being updated, policy 917, parental involvement, is not necessary anymore. And policy 918 ensures compliance with all of the Title I regulations.
Great, thank you. Does anybody have any questions on that? I think one of the things, just as a little context for all of this, is that Mr. Diazio and Dr. Stevenson are working together as we enter this new school year to line up what kind of policy work needs to be done. And one of the things that is certainly within the realm of consideration is, are there policies on our books that are not applicable anymore? Because if there are, and we have the time to fit it into our agenda, we figure it's we lower the maintenance of policy if we repeal them. And so these two policies on the agenda, and perhaps others to come in future agendas, will be those policies that are no longer relevant to our district, and we are going to, they're going to recommend their rescission. So this is the first one, policy 917, and unless there are any questions or concerns, we would move this to the August business meeting next week as a first read for repeal. The repeal process goes through two reads, just like the adoption process does. So does anybody have any questions? Start with Rachel, Mrs. McMenamin, Lydia? Okay, terrific. So that can go for a first read next week towards rescission, repeal, whichever term you prefer to use. And that'll move us into the next item on the agenda, 4.4, policy 919, school performance profiles, which is also recommended for repeal.
Yes, policy 919, school performance profiles. As the committee, I believe, is aware, the Future Ready PA Index has replaced the SPP, school performance profiles. And so the policy 919 on school performance profiles is no longer relevant, and it can be repealed at this point in time. And there's no need currently to adopt a replacement policy to address the Future Ready PA Index, but in the future, if we feel that there needs to be a policy, we can certainly bring one to the committee for consideration.
Yeah, especially since the state changes its mind, every few years about whether it's an SPP or a Future Ready Index. Probably not a worthy investment to make a policy, because it might not be in effect for too long. Does anybody have any questions about this policy and the repeal of it? Rachel? Mrs. McMenamin? Lydia? Nope. Okay, well then, let's put this on the agenda next week as well for a first read towards repeal. And that will move us into actually new work that we have today, which is policy 4.5, Title I, Comparability of Services. Can you give us a little context on this work?
Sure. So this policy is one that is being recommended just for compliance purposes. The district receives funds through Title I, and one of the requirements when you receive Title I funding is that in your schools that don't receive Title I funding, there's an obligation to make sure that the services that are offered to students in schools that are not Title I schools are comparable to the services that are offered to students that are in Title I schools. So periodically, there's auditors that come around and they look at the ways in which you're using your funding and make sure you're in compliance with all of the conditions that are put on those funds. And so one of the things that the auditors will be looking for is a policy which essentially affirms the commitment of the district to ensure that in all schools there's a comparability of services offered to all students, regardless of whether those schools are recipients or beneficiaries of Title I funding. That would be the background on this one.
And Mr. Diazio, maybe for the benefit, I don't know, forgive me, Rachel, if you already have this information, but just for context, for anyone who doesn't know what Title I funding is.
Sure.
Could you briefly just describe that?
Sure. Title I funding comes to schools that have certain demographics, generally language arts funding, math funding, those types of things that come through Title I, correct?
It's a federal program of
Correct.
funding, if not
Correct.
state, it's federal. So where there is
Thank you. That's very
financial,
helpful.
where there is financial need,
Correct.
those schools who have demonstrated financial need and met certain criterias in those areas are eligible for federal funding. And we do have Title I schools within our district, and so we do receive Title I funds for those schools. And so this is the policy that would help promote the guidelines for the distribution and equality of the distribution of those funds. You're welcome. Okay. So given that, I'd like to open it up if anybody has any questions about the way the policy is written or any further content questions. Rachel, do you have any?
Not right now.
Okay. This is just our first read of this. Mrs. McMenamin, do you have any questions?
So, how are we going to ensure that we're doing this? Like, this doesn't stipulate how you're going to decide if it's comparable.
So annually, whoever's in charge of federal programs for the district, there's a lot of paperwork that needs to be completed. I believe it's now done through an online portal. And based on the information that you submit, you make representations as to the information that you provide in connection with that reporting will ensure or give feedback to confirm that there's comparability there. Really, what the board policy is intended to do is to simply acknowledge that requirement. It's essentially to acknowledge what you're already doing. And by continuing to receive the federal funds, you are in compliance with the comparability requirements. So it's, I would need somebody who, that's here, whoever's in charge of federal programs would probably be the better person
So-
to understand exactly what is.
So the Title I, all the title programs, are federal programs that have certain guidelines and they are given scores based on how they're filled out. and they are the ones who were, so they have auditors who are audited on a yearly basis. So this is, those things are the safeguards that, because we get those annual reports saying here, based on those scores on things that we're doing right, what kind of corrections we need to make and those kind of things. So it is, because it's a federal program, they are very diligent about following up on those particular pieces.
All right, so I guess I heard this wrong. I thought that what this policy was supposed to do was ensure that the non-Title I schools had the same programming that the Title I schools have, but it sounds like it's actually the reverse. You want to ensure that your Title I school has equivalent programming to your non-Title I schools. I heard that
So
backwards.
can I just say that you have to remember that even though a school is designated as, say, as a Title I school, because the district, all districts still have to ensure that they give the equal support, so across the board, ensure that. And also, Title I funding goes beyond just school designation. So for instance, it covers things for kids who have qualified under McKinney-Vento and other supports that are addressed with socioeconomic pieces. So there's a whole lot of pieces then that it goes beyond just school designation that the district participates in to ensure that the students have the supports.
And so I thought that we always tried to do that in Radnor. You know, we really have tried to have equity between the elementary schools. It doesn't always happen exactly because there are different schools in different communities and I guess have somewhat different priorities. So do we need this policy? Is this a federal requirement? Is that what you're saying?
It's something that when the auditors come around, they'll be looking to make sure you have a policy in place.
And auditors, by that you mean the Title I
Correct.
federal auditors?
Those that are auditing your use of the federal funds, correct.
Okay, so,
It's just like, it's very similar to the requirement to have a student wellness policy.
okay.
To have non-discrimination policies in both school and classroom practices, hiring and employment practices. The auditors will be looking to make sure that the board has put into place policies that reflect the philosophy and that acknowledge that as a condition of receiving these funds, we acknowledge that we have certain obligations that we need to meet in order to be eligible to continue to receive those funds.
Okay. Do we need ARs to go with this?
This policy should not need an
Okay,
AR.
this is just to meet a requirement.
Correct.
I
Correct.
understand.
On a day-to-day basis, this will not be a policy that's being referred to. It's a broad statement of the board that acknowledges an obligation that's a condition of receipt of federal funds.
Do you want to use Rachel's mic?
As part of filling out your application, comparability is one of the things that has to be done and checked off and be correct, or you can't go any further with your application.
So we're already doing
Yes.
this?
Okay. Any other questions, Lydia, on it?
Not at this time.
No? Okay. I just had a couple wordsmithings that I had mentioned to you, I think, when we had our pre-meeting briefly, so I might have missed it if it had changed, but I had mentioned that when, in the definition, I thought that the second sentence was a little awkward, because it really doesn't read as a sentence, and so I don't know if I could propose perhaps another wording of it, which would be, an example of a grade span is K through 2 and K through 4. It would not be a grade span of K through 2 to K through 5. There were just some verbs that I didn't missing there.
Can you repeat that one more time?
An example of a grade span would be of K through 2 to K through 4, comma, it would not be a grade span of K through 2 to K through 5.
And I'm making the changes in real time on our screen.
Isn't that amazing?
An
Wow.
example of a grade span is
K through 2 to K through 4. It is not a grade span of K through 2 to K through 5. What we had in there originally was not a complete sentence, so I just had a problem with the fact that it had a period at the end of it.
Does that
Just one of
look-
those,
Get rid of that preamble sentence. Just start with an example of.
no, because the first sentence defines what a grade span is. The second sentence provides the
Oh, okay.
example, but it's now actually, the example is actually framed as as a sentence as opposed to just a phrase. So,
And
How does
that change has been made.
that's just brilliant.
That's
Thank you
the-
so much.
that's
Is
the- that's
everybody
the
okay
benefit
with
of
that
board docs. We
change?
can make the changes right in real time.
I was gonna say, you're lucky I agree with that.
It's my lucky day, what can I tell you? And the second wordsmithing is and if you go down to delegation of responsibility, in the second paragraph, it says regardless of buildings per grade span. I would say regardless of the number of buildings per grade span, because I wasn't quite sure when I read it, what was it about the buildings that we were being regardless of. So regardless of the number of buildings per grade span, blah, blah, blah. On from there. Does that work? Okay. Then the very last one I had among complaints was that I always believe that when there are more than two things being compared, instead of using the word between, you use among. So I would propose we change between to among in the last in the sentence under the complaints. Unless anybody wants to contradict that and thinks that I have false understanding of the differences between the difference between the words between and among. And that wraps my comments for 150. Anybody else has any others, please feel free to chime in. Okay, everybody good? I see the teacher representative is nodding her head. I was looking at you, Mrs. McMenamin, being that you're the teacher. Okay, the teacher says okay. So with that, let's move 150, policy 150 for a first read next week. And that'll move us into our final agenda item, which is policy 202, eligibility of non-resident students. For a little context, we'll turn it over to the team over there.
Take that one, or me? Policy 202 is one. A lot of the language we moved to an administrative regulation. Actually, an administrative regulation was created. There was an existing administrative regulation that was very, very short, and it was duplicative of the language that was in the policy. So we created a new administrative regulation which outlines the procedure that the district would follow in the event that there's a concern about a student's residency and whether they continue to be eligible for educational services from the district as a resident student. And then we just cleaned up the policy a little bit to read in a little bit more of a user-friendly way.
Okay, terrific. So does anybody start over again on the right-hand side of the table? Rachel, do you have any questions about this policy?
Okay, yes, I do. Under guidelines, in the first point, this is gonna be a difficult location to describe, so bear with me here, but I'm gonna count the lines. 1, 2. It's the 6th line down, and it says, relative to school requirements, and that they intend to so keep and support the child. I just think the so is a little bit odd there, so I just wanted to point that out. I think it might run a little more smoothly without that. And then also, I was just curious about, I noticed in point 4, it discusses like an assigned facility within the district, and is that what the ABC house falls under? Like, is that how that's included in this policy?
I believe number 4 would be more comparable to
This is like the
So number 4 would be more like the village.
Or St. Ed's. So we have 2 residential facilities in the district where students live. So we can pass through, they're talking about passing through, I believe, the tuition for those students. We can charge it to their actual home district where
Gotcha.
they're from. So say you live in Abington, but you reside at St. Edmund's home.
Mhm.
Eventually, Abington will pay for their education wherever
Okay.
they go
That makes sense.
for school around here.
And
Am I
think
right?
That's correct. And to help put that into context a little bit, a student is a resident of the school district where their parent resides. That's the default rule.
Okay.
But there are some exceptions in the school code that give students an ability or an entitlement to go to a different school district. And one is, for example, like number 4, if a student's parents live in one district, but they are assigned to like a facility where they live in a different school district, they can go to the school district in which they're living, even though their parents live in a different district.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
But Rachel, you raised a good point, and I don't know, Mr. Diazio, if you're familiar with the fact that we do have a Radnor, a better chance home here in Radnor, and those students are residents outside of Radnor, but do reside here through that program, in a house here that sponsors that program. So did your question get answered, Rachel, in terms of its applicability to this policy?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, so I have a question, though. I believe that we do not pass through the tuition for the ABC students. I believe that Radnor sponsors them, so they're actually different
Yes,
than students that are at residential facilities.
Yes, this falls under that. The district provides a waiver for the ABC house.
Okay, just want to make sure everybody's comfortable with the material here. Thank you for weighing in with your questions,
And I made the minor change that Rachel mentioned about removing the word "so," if that's okay with the entire committee.
sounds good to me. Mrs. McMenamin, do you have any questions about the policy 202? And Lydia?
So let me just reiterate. Basically, what we did was take the intent of what we had in our policy and broke it into a nice, concise policy, and then everything, the meat is in the AR, like we want to do with all our policies.
Correct.
Got it.
Yes, this was
Okay.
one that was not driven by a change in the law. We were actually, for the first time in several months, able to get to a policy just as part of a routine review in the student section of the manual.
Yeah, I think we talked about, maybe it was at the last meeting, about if we have the opportunity, because we're not catching up with law changes or other administrative needs, that we would try to embark on some sort of a routine review. And our solicitor recommended that the routine review should probably begin with the 200 section of our policy manual, which deals with student policies. So 202 is right there at the top, and looked like the one as he was going through the list that needed to be addressed. And you'll see as we go through the next few months, 200 policies will probably be appearing here and there as part of our routine review we're attempting, interspersed with other more pressing needs that come up that are responsive to law changes and administrative requests and such.
So I want to just voice maybe a little bit different viewpoint on this, because I believe we have been very diligent with our policies in the past. I'm somewhat opposed to us, sort of starting with a review of policies that I think are in pretty good shape already, that don't have a reason to be looked at. To me, and no offense to you, you're a wonderful guy, but that's money that I don't think we need to spend at this time. It's not like anything's broken. And so I guess it would be my preference, to keep our work, it's a fine line, keep our work to what we need to do. Obviously, we want everything buttoned up, but not to go, overboard and look at things that don't have a problem. That's just my preference, and our colleagues
Well-
aren't here to weigh in. But
Well, I think that Mr. Diazio didn't address 200 and 201 because they were things that didn't need to be addressed. So when he comes across something that administration agrees needs to be updated for the practical functioning of the district, that's the kind of thing he would work on. If he were doing just every policy, he would have started at 200.
Right, but I'm not sure. It would be my opinion that I don't know that we need to have all the policies re-looked at. I guess I'm frugal. I don't see the need for it. I mean, sort of like if you look for something, you're going to find something to do, but this is expensive money for the district. So I guess I just have a little different viewpoint on if we should be doing that as a routine, habit.
There's a few policies in the student section that don't have regulations in them, and I would say that's the biggest gap. And when that's the case, while certainly there's a cost to everything we do, 9 times out of 10, the language has already been drafted internally for, another school district. And so there's sharing that happens, and you get the benefit of language that's already been prepared. And all of our school districts benefit from that. We try to keep the costs down as much as we can. But to your point, I do agree that there are some of the policies that haven't been looked at since 2008. And when you look at them, they're still fine because there's no need to address them. There's a few that I do specifically recommend that there be a regulation in place or some changes, but I agree that we don't necessarily need to look at every policy just because it's 10 years old, because there are quite a number of policies that are 10 or 11 years old and they don't need any work. So it's definitely a balancing, it's a balancing act, for sure.
Yeah, and I think it's important to keep in mind why we have policies. Policies are the laws that govern our district. They're there to protect our students, to protect our staff, to protect the operation of the district. And there are those occasions where, God forbid, you're in a situation where you have to fall back on policy, and policy is the rule book by which you need to operate the district and protect yourself. If it's not, if there, for example, is an administrative regulation that's called for in a policy and it's not in place, it really ties the hands of the administration and could potentially expose us if we don't have that. And so it is recommended that, and I trust Mr. Diazio's judgment. I think he's, and Dr. Stevenson are not looking to make extra work for anybody or spend any extra funds that they don't have to, but the charge of policy is really to protect the district and all of its stakeholders within and the community where that's relevant. So I think that's really what guides their work when they're looking for things is making sure that we are fully protected. And with that, unless that was a conversation stopper. Okay. So that brings us to the end of our agenda in terms of items to be worked on, and we're up to new business. Does anybody have new business? And thank you, by the way, Lydia. I mean, I appreciate your point of view on all of that. I hope that you heard that in the context of multiple considerations and good judgment on the part of our team over there.
Right, I just need to clarify, I'm not in any way saying somebody isn't doing a great job at what they're doing. That's, I want everybody to know that.
Okay, thank you, appreciate that. And the final item on the agenda is public comment. But again, looks like nobody's racing to the podium to give us any public comments. So with that, we will conclude this meeting 30 minutes after it started. Good work, team. Thank you very much for your support, and have a great evening. We'll see you in September.